On June 17, 1775, a British general watches his own army march uphill into gunfire, and he cannot understand what he is looking at. His men keep falling, not a few, not dozens. Whole ranks of them, collapsing in neat rows like dominoes, and the colonial line has not even broken yet. By the time the smoke clears that afternoon, the British will have taken the hill. Newspapers in London will call it a victory. But the officer standing on that battlefield already knows the truth. He will write in his diary that another victory like this one would destroy them completely. This is the story of the day the British Army won a battle and lost the war without realizing it. In the spring of 1775, Boston was a city under siege, except the British were the ones trapped inside it. After the fighting at Lexington and Concord in April, thousands of colonial militia had poured out of the Massachusetts countryside and surrounded the town. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in North America, found himself boxed into a small peninsula with roughly 6,000 troops, cut off from the countryside and increasingly aware that this was not the quick, embarrassing skirmish London had assumed it would be. Gage requested reinforcements. London sent 3 major generals to help him figure out what to do next. William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, the same Burgoyne who would later surrender an entire army at Saratoga, arrived in Boston Harbor in May, and their orders were simple. Break the siege, crush the rebellion before it could organize into anything resembling an army. The colonial forces surrounding Boston were a mess by any European military standard. Farmers, tradesmen, and shopkeepers organized loosely into regiments under the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, poorly supplied and led by officers with almost no formal training. But they had numbers, they had motivation, and they had something the British badly underestimated. They had learned from Lexington and Concord that they could actually hurt professional soldiers if they picked the right ground. On the night of June 16, 1775, colonial forces under Colonel William Prescott were ordered to fortify Bunker Hill, a high point overlooking Boston from the Charlestown Peninsula. Prescott made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of Bunker Hill itself, he pushed his men forward to Breed's Hill, a lower rise much closer to the British-held town and far more exposed to attack. Historians still argue about whether this was a deliberate tactical choice or simple confusion in the dark. What is not disputed is what Prescott's men built there. Working through the night with picks and shovels, roughly 1,200 colonial soldiers threw up an earthen redoubt on Breed's Hill, a rough square fortification with dirt walls, and extended a breastwork running down toward the water. By sunrise, when British lookouts spotted the fresh earthworks looming over Boston, General Gage was staring at a fortified position sitting almost within cannon range of his own headquarters. Gage convened his generals. Henry Clinton argued for a flanking maneuver, landing troops behind the colonial position on the narrow neck of the peninsula and cutting off any retreat entirely. It was the smarter play, the one that could have ended the entire rebellion in an afternoon. William Howe overruled him. Howe insisted on a direct frontal assault, marching his regulars straight up the hill in traditional European fashion, believing that disciplined redcoats advancing in formation would simply overwhelm untrained colonial farmers who had never faced a professional army in open battle. It was a decision built entirely on assumption, and it was about to cost the British Army more than anyone in London could have imagined. On the afternoon of June 17th, British warships in the harbour began bombarding the colonial position, while roughly 2,200 British regulars formed up on the beaches below Breed's Hill. Howe led the assault personally, splitting his force into 2 wings, one aimed at the redoubt itself, the other sweeping around the colonial left flank along the shoreline, where a rail fence stuffed with hay offered the only cover. Inside the American lines, ammunition was desperately short. Colonel Prescott and General Israel Putnam moved along the earthworks, giving an order that would become one of the most repeated lines in American military history. "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Whether those exact words were spoken that day is debated by historians, but the tactic behind them was very real. With gunpowder rationed to almost nothing, the colonial commanders needed every shot to count. No wasted volleys, no firing at extreme range to look brave. Wait, and then fire directly into the packed ranks marching toward you. At around 3 in the afternoon, the British line began its advance up Breed's Hill, marching in tight formation through tall grass and over fences, weighed down by full packs, muskets, and bayonets, climbing a slope in the summer heat directly into a fortified position. At roughly 50 yards, the Colonial line opened fire. The effect was catastrophic. Entire front ranks of British regulars went down within seconds. Officers, easily identifiable by their uniforms and swords, were targeted deliberately and fell in disproportionate numbers. The British line staggered, broke, and retreated back down the hill, leaving the slope littered with dead and wounded men. Howe reformed his shattered ranks and ordered a second assault. The result was almost identical. The Colonial defenders, still holding their ammunition with brutal discipline, waited until the British were dangerously close and fired again, tearing gaps through the advancing lines a second time. By the end of this second attempt, some British regiments had lost the majority of their officers. Howe himself, according to accounts from men standing near him, was left as the only officer on his staff still standing, every aide around him killed or wounded in the assault. 2 attacks, 2 bloody repulses, and the Americans were still holding the hill. Inside the redoubt, Colonial ammunition was almost completely gone. Soldiers were down to a handful of shots per man, some resorting to firing whatever scrap metal and nails they could stuff down their barrels. Howe, refusing to accept another failure, organized a third assault, this time stripping his men of their heavy packs and ordering bayonets fixed, aiming the main thrust directly at the redoubt itself. When the British came forward this final time, the Colonial defenders fired what little they had left, inflicting yet more casualties, and then the guns simply went silent. There was nothing left to fire. British regulars poured over the earthen walls and into the redoubt, and what followed was brutal hand-to-hand fighting with bayonets, swords, and musket butts. Colonel Prescott managed to organize a fighting retreat, pulling his remaining men back off Breed's Hill and across the narrow neck of the peninsula under fire, preventing the kind of total encirclement that could have ended in mass surrender. Among those killed covering the retreat was Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the most important political leaders of the Massachusetts Revolutionary Movement. Warren had been commissioned a major general only days earlier, but he chose to fight in the ranks as a volunteer rather than command from the rear. He was shot in the head near the redoubt and became, instantly, the most prominent martyr of the young rebellion. By the time the fighting ended, the British held Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill beyond it. On paper, this was a clear British victory. The Colonial forces had been driven from their position and forced to retreat. But look at the numbers, because the numbers tell an entirely different story. The British suffered over 1,000 casualties out of roughly 2,200 men engaged, more than 40% of the entire attacking force killed or wounded in a single afternoon. American casualties totaled around 450. The British had lost more than double the number of men, and among those casualties was a devastating proportion of experienced officers, the exact men the British Army needed to lead future campaigns across an ocean from home. General Clinton, who had argued against the frontal assault from the very beginning, reportedly wrote in his private journal that it was a dear-bought victory and that another such victory would have ruined them. Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's future generals, is said to have remarked that he wished the Americans could sell the British another hill at the same price, because if this was what victory cost the most powerful army on earth, the British could not afford very many more victories. Here is the detail that changes how you have to look at this entire battle. Bunker Hill did not just cost the British soldiers, it rewired how they fought for the rest of the war. William Howe, the general who ordered that first disastrous frontal assault, spent the remainder of his command in America moving with a caution that frustrated his own government and baffled his officers. Time after time, in campaigns across New York and Pennsylvania, Howe would maneuver, flank, and delay rather than launch the kind of direct assault against fortified positions that had gutted his own regiments outside Boston. Historians have long debated why Howe seemed so reluctant to finish off Washington's army when he had the chance on more than one occasion. Bunker Hill is almost always part of that answer. He had personally watched what happened when disciplined professional soldiers marched directly into a fortified American line, and he never fully unlearned that lesson. The battle taught the British Army, at devastating cost, that these colonial farmers with muskets and no formal training could inflict casualties on a scale that European warfare rarely produced against irregular forces. And it taught the Americans something just as important: that they could stand, even briefly, against the best army in the world and make it bleed. News of the casualty numbers reached London that summer and landed like a shockwave. Parliament had been told this rebellion was a minor colonial disturbance that professional soldiers would end quickly. Instead, the reports described an entire officer corps gutted in a single afternoon, fighting over one small hill outside Boston. King George III reportedly read the casualty lists with visible alarm. The War Office began recognizing that suppressing this rebellion would require far more men, far more money, and far more time than anyone had planned for in the spring. Recruitment for the war effort in Britain became noticeably harder as word spread of what fighting in America actually cost. The siege of Boston continued for another 9 months after Bunker Hill, with both sides essentially locked in place until Washington finally forced a British evacuation in March of 1776 by fortifying Dorchester Heights with heavy artillery hauled from Fort Ticonderoga. But the psychological turning point had already happened months earlier on that bloody slope above Charlestown. The British had proven they could take a hill. They had not proven they could win a war. Think about what this battle actually represents. It is not a story about who held the ground when the smoke cleared. It is a story about the exact moment the most powerful military machine in the world discovered that this war was going to be far more expensive, in blood and in officers and in time, than anyone in London had ever imagined. Every frontal assault that Howe refused to order for the rest of his command traces back to that afternoon. Every cautious flanking maneuver, every hesitation to finish off Washington's army when the opportunity presented itself, carries the shadow of Breed's Hill inside it. The British Army walked off that battlefield having technically won and having permanently lost something else: confidence that this rebellion could be crushed quickly, cheaply, and without consequence. The hill is quiet now. A granite obelisk stands where the redoubt once held its ground, rising 221 feet above the Charlestown Peninsula, visible for miles across the Boston skyline. Tourists climb its winding staircase without ever fully grasping what happened on the ground beneath it. For one afternoon in June of 1775, farmers and shopkeepers with almost no ammunition left held off the finest army on the planet not once, but twice, and made that same army pay a price so devastating that its own generals questioned whether victory was even worth having. The British took the hill. The rebellion took something far more valuable: proof, delivered in blood, that this war was winnable after all. If this kind of hidden cost breakdown is your thing, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling us which other battle you think was won on paper but lost in every way that actually mattered.